In 1967, a 68-year-old man from the very bottom of New Zealand took a motorcycle he had built in a backyard shed, a bike older than most of the people watching this, and rode it across the white salt of the Bonneville Salt Flats at 184 miles per hour. That record still stands. Nobody has beaten it in almost 60 years. And here's the part almost nobody knows. That number, 184, isn't the number they gave him on the day. For 37 years, the record book said 183.586. Then, long after Burt Munro was dead and buried, his son sat down with the old paperwork, worked the two-way average out again, and found a mistake. The officials had gotten it wrong, so they fixed it in 2014, and a dead man beat his own world record from the grave. Now, if you have seen the Anthony Hopkins movie, you know the shape of this. Old Kiwi, old bike, big dream, the Salt Flats. It's a wonderful film. It's also, in a lot of places, not quite what happened. It squeezes 10 years and nearly 10 trips into a single journey. It puts him over 200 on his record run, which he didn't actually do. And it barely shows you the strangest part of the whole thing, the shed where this bike was really built. Because Burt didn't buy fast parts. He couldn't afford them. He made them. Out of old gas pipe dug up from under the street, a tractor axle, and melted down Ford pistons he cast in a tin can with a blowtorch. So grab a coffee, because the real story is even better than the movie. It starts in Invercargill, a small town near the southern tip of New Zealand's South Island, about as far from the world's racetracks as you can physically get and still be standing on land. That's where Herbert James Munro was born in 1899, though nobody ever called him Herbert. He was Burt. Burt liked going fast from the very start. As a kid, he raced horses across the family farm. As a young man, he rode the dirt speedway. And in 1920, he bought the machine that would quietly take over the rest of his life. A brand new Indian Scout, a 600 cubic centimeters V-twin from the American factory that could do about 55 miles per hour straight out of the crate. 55 wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. In 1926, he started modifying it, and once he started, he basically never stopped. For the next 4 decades, that one motorcycle got taken apart and rebuilt so many times that almost nothing original was left inside it. He bored the engine out again and again until a 600 cubic centimeters motor had slowly grown into a 950 cubic centimeters motor. He threw away the side valve cylinder heads and designed his own. If a part didn't exist, or he couldn't afford it, he made the part. And if the part he made broke, which happened constantly, he made it again. For years, this ran alongside an ordinary life. He had a day job, he had a family, and he'd do the heavy engineering overnight in his workshop, then head to work in the morning having barely slept. But by the late 1940s, the balance had tipped for good. His marriage had ended, and Burt more or less gave up regular work and moved into a shed with the Indian, a second bike, a 1936 Velocette, and his tools. He lived there. He slept there. On one wall, he had written 4 words, "Offerings to the God of Speed." And underneath that inscription, he kept a shelf, and on that shelf sat a growing heap of broken engine parts. Every piston that had shattered, every connecting rod that had snapped. Trophies of failure stacked up where he could see them. Over 50 years, he reckoned he blew that engine up somewhere around 250 times. Anyone else would have taken that as a sign to stop. Burt took it as data. Here's where the movie really glosses over things, and where the real story gets hard to believe. Burt Munro had almost no money and almost no proper equipment. What he had was a tiny lathe, a homemade grinder, a blowtorch, and an imagination that flatly refused to accept the word no. So when he needed high-performance racing parts that a real factory would spend a fortune engineering, he looked around his town and asked a completely different question. Not where do I buy this, but what's lying around that I can turn into this? Take the cylinder barrels. A racing engine barrel has to survive enormous heat and pressure without cracking. Burt made his out of cast iron gas pipe, and not new gas pipe either. Old gas pipe, the stuff the local gas company had dug up out of the street after it had spent years buried underground. His reasoning was pure backyard genius. He figured that decades sitting in the cold ground had seasoned the iron, relieved the stresses inside it, left it stable and settled. So he'd collect the dug-up pipe and turn old street plumbing into engine cylinders. Then there were the connecting rods, the parts that link each piston to the crank and take a violent beating every single revolution the engine turns. Burt kept snapping the standard ones, so he went looking for something stronger, and he found it in a tractor. He got hold of an axle from a Caterpillar tractor, and he carved his connecting rods out of that solid steel, by hand. Then he hardened and tempered them himself, in his own shed, until they would take 143 tons of tension before they'd give up. When he traveled, he carried those hand-carved rods halfway around the planet in a rawhide suitcase. And the pistons. This is my favorite part of the whole thing. Burt cast his own pistons out of scrap metal. He'd collect old aluminum pistons. British Ford ones were his favorite, melt them down, and pour the liquid metal into molds. And the whole furnace he melted them in was a blowtorch, a 5-gallon can packed with coke, and in his own words, a WE iron pot. No proper furnace. The dies he cast the pistons in, he made those too, out of a lump of tractor axle steel he'd found lying beside a road. He had no way to test whether any of this metal was actually good. No lab, no instruments, nothing. He just looked at it. He said he could tell a good piston by eye, and then he'd finish it off on that homemade grinder. Early on, a single piston took him a week to make. Later, he got it down to about a day. He filed the profiles of his camshafts by hand. He used an old bicycle spoke as a measuring tool, and when he built the long, smooth, streamlined shell that would eventually cover the entire bike, the hoops holding its shape were made from recycled fence post stakes. And people badly underestimate what all of this took. Underneath the scrounging was real engineering. He converted the old side valve engine to overhead valves and designed his own cylinder heads to do it, the kind of work that proper factories staffed whole departments to handle. He built himself a clutch with something like 17 plates and around 1,000 pounds of spring pressure just to get all that new power to the ground without slipping. In his own words, for 10 years he worked 16 hours a day in that shed. And when he was eventually told to ease off, he settled for 70-hour weeks. This was a man who had quietly turned his entire life into one single engineering problem. There's even a famous story that he cast pistons in holes he dug in the sand at the local beach. That one, his son says, isn't actually true. But it tells you everything about the reputation the man had, that people heard what he really did and just assumed the wildest possible version had to be real. Sit with this for a second. A world-land speed record, one that would outlast the man who set it by decades, was ridden on cylinders made from old street gas pipe, connecting rods carved from a tractor axle, and pistons cast in a tin can with a blowtorch by one man working alone in a shed at the bottom of the world. The movie gives you a lovable old tinkerer. That's true as far as it goes, but it badly undersells him. This was serious, self-taught mechanical engineering, done with garbage and stubbornness by a man with no formal training, and the maddening thing is that it worked. For years, Burt had been quietly rewriting New Zealand's own speed records on local beaches, running the Indian Flat out on the hard, wet sand at a place called Arithmetic Beach. Long before Bonneville had ever heard his name, he was a fixture out there, a slightly mad old man on a screaming machine, and he'd already set a whole string of New Zealand records on that sand. But by the 1950s, he'd hit a wall. His bike had outgrown his own country. New Zealand simply didn't have anywhere long enough, flat enough, and safe enough to find out how fast the thing could really go. There was one place on Earth that did, the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. Mile after mile of dead flat, rock-hard salt, where the fastest people alive went to chase records. The problem was getting there. From Invercargill, Bonneville meant crossing an ocean and then a continent, and Burt Munro had almost no money to do it with. So he saved for years and he improvised the rest. He crossed the Pacific by working his passage on a cargo ship, sleeping down among the freight. He finally made it to Bonneville in 1962. He was 63 years old, he had a heart condition, and he turned up with a pre-First World War motorcycle he had rebuilt in his shed, parked right next to sponsored American teams with their trucks and trailers and budgets. The officials very nearly did not let him run at all. The bike had almost none of the safety equipment the rulebook demanded, and a few things were held together in ways that made the scrutineers deeply nervous. This is one thing the film gets exactly right, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the warmest part of the true story. It was not the organizers who saved his weekend, it was the other racers. The Americans took one look at this stubborn old man and his homemade machine, and instead of laughing him off the salt, they basically adopted him. They vouched for him. They helped him get the bike legal enough to run, and they spent their own time keeping his ancient Indian alive. A man who had crossed the entire planet alone suddenly had a pit crew of strangers, and then he was fast. Not good for his age fast, actually fast. On that very first trip in 1962, he set a class record at nearly 179 miles per hour. And then he kept coming back. This is the single biggest thing the movie compresses. On screen, it is one heroic journey, start to finish. In reality, Burt went back to that salt again and again all through the 1960s. He made the trip roughly 10 times and raced across 9 of them. In 1966, he set another record, a little over 168 miles an hour in a different class. And there was a real method to all of it. Almost every year he came back with a bigger engine. Back in 1962, he had run it bored out to around 850 cubic centimeters. By 1966, it was up close to 920 cubic centimeters. By 1967, he had taken it all the way out to 950 cubic centimeters, right up against the ceiling of the under 1,000 cubic centimeters class, squeezing out every last mile an hour the rules would let him have. Every single trip, he learned something. Every trip, the bike got a little more sorted and a little more terrifying. Because by the mid-1960s, the Indian did not even look like a motorcycle anymore. Burt had wrapped it inside a long, cigar-shaped shell he had hand-shaped himself, and to ride it, he had to lie down flat and get sealed inside, almost lying on top of the engine. And this is the detail that should make your stomach drop. There was no jumping clear. He was enclosed, feet first, more or less strapped into a homemade metal tube with a screaming engine underneath him. If something let go at 180 miles an hour, and things let go on that bike constantly, he had nowhere to go and no way out. The gearbox was a 3-speed he changed by hand. The power went to the back wheel through a triple chain. It was, by any normal standard, a completely insane way to travel, and he had built every strange piece of it himself. There were costs the film mostly skips over too. When Burt started running in the United States, he switched to burning nitromethane, a far more aggressive racing fuel than anything he could get at home. He could not buy it in New Zealand at all, so an American family he had befriended, the Pierces, used to bottle nitromethane up in old wine bottles and ship it out to him, so he could keep developing the engine over the New Zealand winter. That nitro is a big part of why he kept burning holes clean through his own home-cast pistons. The fuel that made him fast was also quietly eating his engine alive, and the danger was not abstract. It was physical, and it was written on his body. On his runs, the exhaust ran so close to his leg inside that tight streamlined shell that the muffler burned the skin of his leg while he was pinned in there at speed, unable to move, with nowhere to go but forward. He just rode through it and worried about the burn later. If you are enjoying this, hit subscribe. This channel digs up exactly these stories, the real history behind the famous ones. Now, everything so far was the buildup. This next part is the reason we're here, which brings us to 1967, Burt's final trip to Bonneville, and the one that put his name in the record books for good. By now, he was 68 years old, and the Indian underneath him was 47 years old. Stop and think about that gap. He was riding a machine built the year after the First World War ended, and he was about to take it faster than almost any motorcycle its size had ever gone. But the bike was living right on the edge of what it could physically survive. It had been pushed so far, and so much of it was now one-off parts Burt had made by hand, that by 1967, the whole thing had to be almost completely torn down and rebuilt after roughly every 10 minutes of running. 10 minutes. That's the reality sitting behind the record. By now, this was a handmade thing balanced on a knife edge. You couldn't just point it and fire. Keeping it alive long enough to make one clean pass was half the entire battle. Getting to a record attempt took the whole week's worth of patience. The salt has to be right, the weather has to be right. and the bike has to survive the run. So Burt would nurse the Indian through a pass, then tear it straight back down, check everything, and wait for the next good window. Picture a man in his late 60s doing heavy mechanical work in the desert heat, in between runs that could genuinely kill him, chasing a number that so far lived only in his own head. And don't lose sight of the body doing all of this. Burt was a man in his late 60s with a known heart condition, lying sealed inside a homemade metal tube, being burned by his own exhaust, on a machine that could come apart under him at any second. Younger men, fitter men, fully funded men have died chasing a lot less than this. He kept doing it anyway, year after year, on his own money, for no prize and no sponsor and no trophy worth the name. He did it because he couldn't stand the thought that there was still a little more speed left in the bike than he'd managed to find. And he was chasing something very specific now. He wanted the outright record for a streamlined motorcycle under 1,000 cubic centimeters. Everything, the years in the shed, the gas pipe cylinders, the tractor axle rods, the ocean crossings, the burned leg, all of it came down to a handful of passes across a white desert in the summer of 1967. To even qualify for the record, he had to make a fast enough run through the timed section first. He did a lot better than qualify. On one of those runs, he was clocked at 190.07 miles per hour. Let that one land properly. 190 miles an hour on a motorcycle from 1920, and that one-way pass still stands as the fastest speed ever officially recorded on an Indian. Full stop. And remember where this machine started. Straight from the factory in 1920, an Indian Scout would do about 55 miles an hour. He'd done it the hard way. 40 years of turning one slow motorcycle into the fastest of its kind on the entire planet, one handmade part at a time. So here's what actually happened versus what the movie shows you. A land speed record isn't one dramatic dash in a single direction. To make it official, you run the course both ways, and they average your two times together. That's how they cancel out any help from a tailwind or from a slight lean in the surface. And it doubles the danger, because you don't get to survive one good run and stop. You have to hold the whole thing together, both directions, back to back, on a bike that wants a full rebuild every 10 minutes. So Burt made his runs, they took the two-way average, and the clocks handed him a brand new world record in the under 1,000 cubic centimeters streamliner class. The figure they wrote on the certificate that day was 183.586 miles per hour. Hold on to that number because it comes back. Now the film. In the movie, the whole story builds to one climactic run, where Hopkins, playing Burt, pushes past 200 miles an hour with the bike shaking itself to pieces around him, and it is a genuinely thrilling few minutes of cinema. The number that flashes up on screen is 201.851. It's a great scene, but it isn't the record. Burt's official record run was down in the 180s, not over 200. Here's where it gets interesting though, because that 200 plus number in the movie wasn't invented out of thin air. Burt really did break 200. On a separate, unofficial run, he was timed at 205.67 miles per hour, which is staggering for that machine. But that run never counted as the official record because of how and when it was measured. So the truth is split cleanly in two. His official record sat in the 180s. His single fastest measured speed really was north of 205. What the film did was glue the drama of that 205 run onto the moment of the actual record and fold years of separate attempts down into one afternoon, because that's what a 2-hour movie has to do to work. Picture it from inside that shell. Burt is lying flat, sealed in, the 47-year-old engine screaming inches beneath his body, the salt turning to a white blur, and he is holding a machine he built out of scrap dead straight while it does everything it can to tear itself apart. One wrong twitch at that speed and there's no walking away. He held it. A man who by rights should have been retired and taking things easy set an outright world record on homemade cylinders and a tractor axle crank. And the same people who'd watched him fight just to get onto the salt in the first place were now watching him rewrite what an old Indian could do. And the movie earns the ending it gives you. The emotional core of it, the burned leg, the near disaster, the tough old man riding through the pain and coming home a hero, all of that is true. He really did ride hurt. He really did go home to New Zealand a legend. The film got the heart of it exactly right. It just tidied up the numbers and folded up the timeline to fit the whole thing on one screen. There's one more thing worth knowing about that movie, because it explains why it feels so true even in the places where it bends the facts. The man who made it, director Roger Donaldson, did not come to Burt Munro as a stranger hunting for a good story. Back in 1971, while Burt was still alive, Donaldson made a short documentary about him. It was called, of all things, Burt Munro, Offerings to the God of Speed, the same words Burt had scrawled on his shed wall. Donaldson had met the real man. He had filmed him in the real shed, surrounded by the real shelf of broken parts, years before Hopkins ever put on the cardigan. Then he spent more than 20 years trying to turn that into a proper feature film. He finally managed it in 2005, decades after Burt had died. So when the movie compresses 10 trips into one, or nudges the top speed up over 200, it is doing it on purpose. Donaldson knew the truth better than almost anyone alive, and he chose which true things to keep and which ones to bend, so that 2 hours could carry the weight of a 50-year obsession. That is the reason the feeling of it is dead right, even when the numbers on screen are not. After 1967, Burt did exactly what Burt always did. He went home and he kept tinkering. He never once stopped believing he could coax the thing into going faster, and he kept working on his bikes almost right to the end. He died in 1978 back home in Invercargill at the age of 78. His record, the official 1967 one, just sat there in the books after he was gone. Year after year, nobody in that class beat it. The old man from Invercargill and his shed-built Indian kept holding the line long after he had died. And then came the twist that no movie could ever have included, because it happened decades after the credits rolled. Remember that number off the certificate, 183.586 miles per hour. Years later, Burt's son John went back through the original 1967 paperwork and rechecked the two-way average himself, run by run, and he found something. The officials had made a straight arithmetic error in the original calculation. Worked out correctly, Burt had not gone 183.586 miles per hour at all. He had gone 184.087 miles per hour. He had quietly been faster than they had ever credited him the entire time, for decades, and nobody had noticed. So in 2014, the record was formally corrected, 184.087 miles per hour. 37 years after Burt Munro died, he beat his own world record one last time, on a piece of paper, without turning a single wheel, and it still stands. As of today, more than half a century on, nobody has taken that under 1,000 cubic centimeter streamliner record off him. In fact, the governing body eventually retired the whole category, which means, in a very real and permanent way, Burt Munro holds it now for good. There is no longer a way for anyone to take it from him. Think about what that means. A record set on a motorcycle from 1920 by a man born in 1899 has now stood for well over half a century, long enough that the sport itself moved on and closed the class around it. Records like that just do not happen anymore. The world caught up to what he'd done slowly. In 2006, the year after the film came out, Burt was inducted into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame in the United States, finally given a proper seat at the table alongside the factory racers he'd embarrassed on a bike he'd built in a shed. And in 2017, on the 50th anniversary of that 1967 run, his great-nephew, a New Zealand road racer named Lee Munro, took a modern Indian Scout back to the same salt flats to honor him. He was not there to break the record. You cannot really break it anymore. He was there because half a century later, the family name and that stretch of white desert are still bound together, and everyone standing on the salt that day knew it. The bike itself is still with us too. You can go and stand in front of the real Munro Special. It sits in a hardware store in Invercargill, E. Hayes & Sons, the actual machine, right next to the actual shelf of broken pistons and snapped connecting rods, the real offerings to the God of Speed. Even the movie prop is there, parked beside the real thing that inspired it, so you can see the legend and the truth in the same room. So that is what the film left out, or quietly rounded off. It turned nearly 10 separate trips into one. It moved his record up over 200 miles per hour when the real record sat in the 180s, and his genuine 205 miles per hour came on a run that never officially counted. It could not include the 2014 correction at all because that landed 9 years after the movie came out, and it could only ever hint at the sheer strangeness of the workshop those records were built in. None of that makes the film dishonest. It just means the real story is even bigger than the 2 hours they had to tell it in. a man built a world-beating motorcycle out of gas pipe and tractor axles in a shed at the bottom of the world, took it faster than anyone thought possible when he was nearly 70, and then, from beyond the grave, went just a little bit faster still. The movie gave you the legend. The workshop gave you the man.